Audio level, David Crisafulli. Hello, mate. David Crisafulli, testing 1, 2, 3, Leader of the Opposition. Hello. Thank you. Well, like most Queenslanders, it was difficult not to be moved by what we heard and what we saw into the inquest of Hannah's death. And today we stand before Queenslanders in offering our support for the government to get cracking on solutions. We have respectfully waited for the inquest to finish, and I think that was fair and proper, as has the government. Now we must turn our attention to ensuring that tragedies like these don't continue to occur in the frequency that they do. When you read the victim impact statement of Lloyd and Sue, it is genuinely difficult not to be emotional to see what recent times have done to their lives, and it is important for them that we get justice for them. And as legislators, we can't just be moved, we have to get moving and find solutions. And today we stand before you to put forward some of the things that we believe could be implemented immediately, and we look forward to the government working with us to do so. And I'll ask Amanda to start.
Thank you, David. And similarly, our condolences continue to be with Lloyd and Sue Clark and the family. Why I'm standing up today is because some of the key recommendations that will come out of this investigation and the evidence that we have heard are the same recommendations that we have been hearing since 2015, 7 years ago. The government has had time to act. The government, through the Not Now, Not Ever, through the coronial investigation into Tara Brown, the coronial investigation into Doreen Langham, the Hear Her Voice statements and recommendations, and now the coronial investigation into Hannah Clark and her 3 children, outlines very clearly where there have been system failings and where there is opportunity for the government to act and address. And those 3 things are this. There does need to be an integration of information sharing. At the moment, we have seen testimony where there are gaps in the system when it comes to information sharing and provision of information, and that has caused significant risk to the victims who currently are requiring organisations to be able to work collaboratively together to protect themselves. The second is a significant investment and accessibility to perpetrator programs. That will put the onus back onto the perpetrator and the offender and take that onus away from the victim. If we are serious about ending domestic and family violence, the only way to stop the cycle is to invest in perpetrator programs. And the third is around judicial and police training, and that's why we have our colleague Dale last who will speak to that. But 3 practical actions that could be taken by the government, and in fact should have already been implemented by the government since 2015 on the back of the Not Now, Not Ever, and we've seen no action in those areas. I'll pass over to Dale, who can expand upon the police.
The system that was designed to protect people like Hannah Clark and her children has clearly failed. 18 months ago, at budget estimates, I questioned this government about domestic violence and the way it was being investigated, and there was an acknowledgement that it was cumbersome, that there needed to be change. And we were given an assurance at that point in time that there were going to be changes, that there were new ideas and new processes to be implemented. And here we are, 18 months later, still looking for this government to get out of first gear when it comes to how they deal with domestic violence in this state. We've heard evidence this week from the President of the Police Union that there are issues around how police deal with domestic violence, the timeframes involved, and more importantly, the training or the lack thereof. And this is not just training for our recruits, but training for operational police right across the state. And clearly there needs to be significant changes in that space going forward. And some of those recommendations that came out of the inquest over the last couple of weeks, more permanent officers in the vulnerable persons unit, streamlining those processes, sharing information, fundamental things that you would think would be able to be implemented within a relatively short period of time. And clearly, this cannot be allowed to drag on. There needs to be changes, and it needs to happen today. We want a commitment from this government that they're going to get out of first gear, make the changes that are necessary, give the police the training and, if necessary, the resources that they need to be able to deal with and respond to domestic violence, because it is a growing issue right across Queensland. We heard that in some of our areas and some of our communities across Queensland, some police officers are now spending up to 90% of their shift dealing with domestic violence incidents. Time to act, Minister Ryan, is now. Not tomorrow, not next week. We want to see action, all Queenslanders want to see action today, and we're looking for that commitment from this government. Oh look, absolutely there should be reform in that area. It's no point waiting until the perpetrator takes some sort of action or does something, and as we saw in the Hannah Clark situation, where they take action to the extent where they actually take someone's life. And that needs to be included in this overhaul of domestic violence right across the state. That early intervention, what are the triggers? What are the warning signs when police are responding to calls for domestic violence? And what action can they take at that point? We've just heard from the Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence about the need for perpetrator programs. Clearly there's a gaping hole in that space at the moment.
Thanks, Lane. It's a really good question. When it comes to, and that is why it is so important that the investment in perpetrator programs is delivered right now. Why that's important, and if you point to the coronial inquest into Tara Brown, after that perpetrator and that offender completed the perpetrator program, he was deemed high risk. Police then knew exactly, or potentially could have known that he was going to be high risk and what he was going to commit. And when we look at just our DVO breaches across the state, for example, they are rising at a significant rate, yet and this is why training is required for the judicial system as well, is that sometimes the consequences for those breaches do not actually meet the risk. And that is something that the judiciary need to look at. That is reform that as legislators we need to look at. But perpetrator programs and investment there is at the heart of how you can assess the risk of an individual perpetrator. And that points as well to the investment required into perpetrator programs, the standard and practice principles. At the moment, perpetrator programs across this state are not regulated in a way that what you may receive in Brisbane, what you may receive in Logan, accessibility in Mount Isa are all different. They're delivered by different providers and they're delivered with different standards. And that's where the reform and the investment is required. I think what it acknowledges is that without investment and government intervention to put this on the agenda as a priority, then we are continuing to fail victims of domestic and family violence. And the government is continuing to fail perpetrators, majority of which are men, at early intervention. There is an opportunity in a first offence or in a risk assessment to be able to refer, to be able to provide support and access for perpetrators very early on. We're seeing already in the private sector, in large companies and organisations, perpetrator leave, paid leave to be able to embark upon education. And if we really are truly wanting to stop and end the cycle of violence, then we need to intervene early. That doesn't take away from what we've seen in the outcomes of this investigation. He was a very, very dangerous perpetrator. What is concerning about that is we know when we speak to high-risk teams across the state, there are many more out there just like that. and women are dealing with this every single day, and the government is continuing to fail each day that they do not invest in perpetrator programs. We still must try. When there are system failures and gaps, when we look back that information was not shared, that there were significant warning signs about his actions through strangulation. You speak to women all across this state who are experiencing strangulation, stalking, where there has not been intervention by the QPS, or there's not been intervention and information that's been shared across government departments. When we're looking at how we manage high-risk processes, that is a failing. I don't think we can look back and say, well, he was always going to do it, so let's not try. Where there are gaps in the system and where we can try, we must, and we owe it to every woman and every victim of domestic and family violence to do so. We've seen the same recommendations in 2 previous coronial investigations in the last 5 years, and still no action. Still no action to close those gaps. If those gaps had been closed, would there have been a different outcome? We don't know, but we owe it to women in high-risk situations right now to ensure we do close those gaps. The state should be appalled at the current lack of access for safe housing for women. It is the #1 cause of homelessness, particularly for women in domestic and family violence situations. And women at the moment are placed in danger because they have no choice. They have no choice where to go. Refuges are being held up full with women that are there 12 to 18 months with no transitional housing. This government needs to hang its head in shame that it does not provide safe refuge for women trying to flee domestic and family violence.
The hotel quarantine program has been farcical in the way that it's been administered, and I want to reflect on what the Premier said yesterday when she says there are contracts that have to be honoured. We're talking about contracts that have been signed this year. We're talking about money that hasn't been recouped this year. It seems to me that the government isn't able to pivot away from life in lockdowns. It seems to me that the government can't roll out a plan for what life is like 2 years beyond the pandemic. And when you have taxpayers' money that's just treated as a plaything, when you have a culture where tens of millions of dollars can be just thrown away because of a lack of attention to detail when it comes to hotel quarantining across the spectrum, every taxpayer will feel aghast. We are in the middle of a health crisis, the likes of which we have never seen before, and tens of millions of dollars are being thrown down the drain. That is bitterly disappointing. The pandemic response, the way that Queensland is mobilised and the way that hotel quarantine was used across the nation was essential, and no one will ever suggest otherwise. The frustration is that we are still seeing tens of millions of dollars go out the door in rooms that aren't being used, meals that aren't being served, and no plan for the government to pivot away from life in lockdown. At the same time, the government was standing up at Wellcamp spruiking a new facility. They were writing cheques for tens of millions of dollars for rooms that were never being used and meals that were never being served. That's a government that is unable to pivot from life after lockdown. That's a government that no longer can plan, a government that treats taxpayers' money these days as though it doesn't matter. And that's been a progression. That's behaviour that we are seeing in a third term, where blowouts on everything the government's involved in, it just seems to be as though they don't believe it matters anymore. These are tens of millions of dollars that could have been put towards fixing the Queensland health crisis. Tens of millions of dollars that belong to Queenslanders, and the government hasn't been able to transition to life after lockdown, and it can no longer plan and it can no longer respect the taxpayer dollar. That is when government has given up. Well, it's twofold. One is the government firstly has to, when it's rolling out schemes like this, it has to have its back of house sorted. It didn't. But I think the biggest thing that's getting under Queenslanders' skin is that we are still paying for rooms that will never be needed. To this day, there are hotels throughout the state that are not being used. And the government can't just say, well, that's a contract we have to honour. They were still signing the contracts when Wellcamp was opening. Now, Wellcamp is vastly under capacity. We don't know how much it's costing. We continue to ask questions. We sincerely hope the Auditor-General will blow the whistle on it, because the government hides behind RTI processes that, quite frankly, are just wrong. But in the meantime, every taxpayer deserves to know that at some stage the government is going to wake up and realise that they must plan for life after lockdown. They must plan 2 years beyond a pandemic for living with COVID. And they must start valuing taxpayers' dollars again. Thank you. Very much.